see how this works here. So hopefully we're going to define a parasite. We're going to look at the life cycle, kind of spend some emphasis on Homunculus contortus, which is the barber worm or the worst internal parasite as far as small ruminants are concerned. And then we're going to talk about maybe what we should do coming out of a drought. So here we go. So I think if you're a sheep and goat producer, I think you're very well aware that gastrointestinal parasites are our biggest enemy, and Homunculus contortus, or the barber worm, is definitely our #1 enemy out of all of those. These are factors that influence parasitism: temperature, humidity. Do we have plenty of moisture? Is it warm enough? There's a lot of difference between a young lamb and an adult as far as parasitism goes. There's a seasonality to it. Pregnancy, we see that rise in parasites with does and ewes when they lamb and kid. Anthelmintic resistance or dewormer resistance plays a huge part in this. And then how we manage pastures and nutrition is very important as far as parasites are concerned. One important thought that I want to get across is you're not going to solve your parasite problems with drugs. We will try to manage parasites, and that is a management tool. Drugs are part of one of our tools in our toolbox, but you will never solve your problem parasites, putting all your hope in dewormers. So keep that in mind. So when we talk about control, I think it's really important that you have a general understanding of the life cycle of parasites, and you have to have an understanding of behavior of your animals as well. And one of the important things to prevent parasitism is being able to recognize there's going to be situations that are more risky than others. And I think if you've been in a drought and you're coming out of a drought, especially depending on the time of the year that you come out of that drought, that could definitely be a situation that is going to require you to be careful. In my experience, when I was in practice, I think back 2011, we had a pretty bad drought in this area where I live. We came out of that drought, and the small ruminant producers started calling me and saying, I'm having all this trouble. And it's like, you forgot about parasites during that drought because you didn't have any problems, and you forgot to monitor, and you forgot to do all these key things that we do to prevent this. And so that's why you got to be able to assess these situations that come up and be prepared for them. Just to find a parasite, just remember, it's a small organism that lives on a larger organism. We call the larger organism a host. They're a normal part of life. They're here. They've been here for as long as the animals have been here, right? And it's not very normal to be infected with a parasite. There's nothing wrong with that. And just because you have a parasite doesn't mean that you have a disease. And we need to, when we think of parasites, we get that ick factor, and we don't like it, and that's understandable. But just remember, because an animal has a few parasites, that's not the end of the world. I think if you look at these pictures here of these animals, I would almost guarantee you, if we could get some fecal material from these and do a fecal egg count, they're going to find some eggs in that fecal. But if you look at those animals, they look pretty healthy. And I think that's what we have to remember with our animals. Be careful about trying to get rid of all the parasites. We should be focused a little bit more on making sure that they're healthy. Nematodes, what we're going to talk about tonight, we commonly refer to these as worms. They live in the digestive tract. Most of these will have what we refer to as a direct life cycle. That means they do not have to, during their life cycle, they don't go to an intermediate host before they wind up in their final host. Nematodes cause a lot of problems. If we look at what outside of undetermined cause, non-predator cause of death, internal parasites are responsible for for kid and adult deaths when it comes to goats. Sheep, not much different, but it's the second leading cause as far as adults and in lambs. So this is our biggest health challenge that we have when it comes to small ruminants. There are a lot of nematodes that small ruminants can get, and most of them are not going to cause problems unless there's some unusual situation. So these listed here occasionally might cause disease, but not normally. That's a trichurus egg you see there. You'll see those every now and then if you do a fecal egg counts, but it's not common to see them. These are another group, very rarely cause problems. Nematodes might if you lived up north. And I'm in Oklahoma, so I'm kind of speaking from my Oklahoma roots here. Would very unusual that we'd see a problem with this egg, and that's the one that's on the picture right here. It's really fun to find. Again, it's kind of like trichurus. It's the largest egg that we will find in most of our fecals that we see. So, but then you get to the bad boys, and that would be Homuncus, Telodorsagia, and Trichostrongylus. These are the three that cause most of the problem, with Homuncus being the most pathogenic of any of them. It can wreak havoc on animals and by far causes the most damage when we're dealing with these. But these are three to remember. Unfortunately, we changed the name of Telodorsagia. It used to be easy to remember by the acronym HOT, but we no longer cause Telodorsagia is no longer Ostratagia circumcincum, it's Telodorsagia circumcincum. So you'll just have to remember HTT. When we look at the life cycle, there's three stages to it. You have your development stage, and this is where the organism is outside the animal. So this is going to be your eggs and your larvae, L1, 2, and 3. Then you have a pre-patent or pre-adult stage. This is at the time when the animal ingests the L3, the infective larvae, and your L4, L5, and those premature adult stage. The adult stage or patent stage is when they are mature enough to produce eggs. So there's three stages there. And this is the typical life cycle that you see. And this is a goat, and it's based on Homuncus. But the eggs pass in the feces. If environmental conditions are right, they're going to hatch. And that will be your first stage larva, L1. L1 will molt to L2. Now, L1 and L2, they feed on bacteria in the fecal material, and they stay in that fecal pellet. When L2 molts to L3, it's got to get out of that fecal pellet to continue on its life cycle. So it's going to get out, crawl up some grass, and then an unsuspecting animal is going to come along and eat that. Then it's going to molt inside the animal to L4. L4 will molt to L5, and then L5 will mature to adult. Now, L4 can also go into that arrested development stage where it just sits out if it's Homuncus, in the abomasum until conditions are right for it to molt to L5. And that's a survival strategy as far as the parasite's concerned. So some facts that are important. As far as nematodes are concerned, they've got to have warm weather and they've got to have humidity. Keep in mind, we're talking about the parasite's environment and not ours. So remember, we're talking about what's happening down there in down there on the ground level, not what we are. So humidity can be quite different down there compared to what it is up in the atmosphere. So L3 is the infective stage. That's our infective larva, that third stage larva. And a good fact to remember is 90% of those infective larvae are going to be at 4 inches or below in that grass. They can migrate away from that fecal pad, maybe as much as 3 feet, but most are going to be pretty close to it. And again, that L4 can go into arrested development and hang out for some time. And that's a survival instinct there that allows it to do that. There's two things that happen that keep this worm from dying out. One is that arrested development. The other is that the L3 is very resistant. It has a double sheath because it never loses that cuticle or skin when it molts to L3. The L2 sheath stays on it, and that protects it from the environment. And that's two important ways that it is able to maintain its life cycle, and we don't get rid of it completely. Clinical signs of parasitism. I'm sure if you've had small ruminants, you've seen these signs, I'm sure at some point or another. The rough hair coat, diarrhea, anemia is probably most likely only seen in homuncus. You might see it in Teledorsagia, but usually just homuncus and that bottle jaw, that edema that we see because of the hypoproteinemia. You don't have protein, we get breakdown in our little vessels and fluid starts to leak through them. Of course, they lose body condition, they're losing weight and death. There are subclinical signs. They're all going to be associated with production issues where we don't gain like we should and those types of things. Homuncus contortus, as we said, it's a bloodsucker, causes anemia, performance issues, and death. This is a bad worm, okay? If you can see this picture here, you can see these little worms in that abomasum. It's necropsy. I spoke Saturday about this subject, and I was talking about him when I was in practice. I had a friend bring me a goat, and he was upset it died, and I looked at it one moment. I said, "Hey, your it's got parasites." He said, "It can't be. I just wormed it." So I proceeded to do a necropsy, and when I got to the abomasum opened up, I actually could see waves of the fluid in there, the worms, where there were so many worms in it, it was just making waves in there. So you can get some really high numbers of these worms before you know it in some of these animals.
Hey, Barry, you've got a question here. How
Okay.
long can how long can L4 stay in arrested development?
I'm going to say probably a couple, 2-3 months or so, somewhere in that range. But let me say this. I just read wasn't a new article, but there was one article I read that they said 50 weeks, that they talked about how long they were in that development stage. That would be probably very, very unusual. Most of them are what they're going to do in that arrested development stage. They're going to overwinter, or they're going to go into it in the hot, dry times and get through that hot, dry summer. And they're going to be, when it cools and moisture comes, they're going to go ahead and molt to an L5. So normally you think about it, we get to an animal, from late fall till spring is when you're going to see it up north. So you're thinking, 2 to 4 months at the most. And the same thing maybe in the summer. That's going to be more normal. But there is some unusual cases where they have lasted a long time. Okay. The Barber worm, the name of it comes from that egg-filled uterus. It's surrounded by that blood-filled intestine. These guys are egg-laying machines, and they can develop rapidly. In 3 weeks, they can go from an egg to an adult when things are going right. And this is just one example. 1/5 of circulating red blood cells can be taken from a lamb's every day, basically. And that is, you think, how long could you or I lose 1/5 of our circulating red blood cells before we are going to get really sick? So that gives you an idea of how devastating these worms can be. There's 3 different syndromes when it comes to homuncus. We've got the hyperacute. This is one where you just walk out and you find an animal that's dead. It's usually pretty obvious, it'll be anemic and you know what's happened, but it's really fast. And then you can have an acute, which is just a little bit slower, but you start to notice these poor doing animals. They're anemic, uh, very weak, and they'll die. These are the ones that if you stress or something, they'll just fall over probably and can die rather quickly. Then you got a chronic where there's some weight loss and weakness. It doesn't happen very fast. This is usually because we're not paying close attention. It happens during the time of the year that we don't think we're going to have problems with worms, or or we're not using some control measures like we should. So temperature is really important. Optimal 68 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see variations of that if you different studies, but for the most part, they like that. I always say 65 to 85 is easier for me to remember, but somewhere in there. And it varies too, depending on homuncus. This is more for homuncus. Teledorsagia will take colder times. Trichostrongus will be in between. One thing we know, though, as development becomes very poor as the temperature goes down, and as it gets too hot, we don't have much development. Humidity is really important. If you get below, get lower in the humidity, you're not going to see development for this parasite. But keep in mind, you're talking about what's happening down there in the grass and not what we're experiencing. So if you get into, even when we sometimes get into the summer months and it gets hot, go out and you got a bunch of dew on the ground, that humidity down there is going to be conducive for those parasites to develop. So you have to keep that in mind, especially in certain types of grasses, thick Bermuda sod and those types of things. But hopefully, if I believe, and I've been laughed at before believing in the weatherman, this is what I got off the Mesnet website today. So hopefully a lot of us are fixing to come out of a drought, right? That's what we hope. As Gary McManus, I heard say, it may not be, what do you say? This might be a drought quencher, maybe not a drought buster. But start to think, what do we expect when we come out of the drought? We should be, what are our temperatures going to be? Again, ideal temperatures for development of parasites. We're obviously going to have some pretty good humidity. I think we're going to be right where, and your soil moistures are going to increase, which are going to be conducive for development of eggs. So keep in mind how long it takes homuncus to develop. I mean, as little as 3 weeks, we can have a lot of L3 larvae out there we can go from an egg to an adult as little as 3 weeks when conditions are right. And we may be going to hit those conditions. And it worries me because, at least in my area, we had a tough summer last year. We've grazed our pastures down. So a lot of these animals don't have any choice but to be getting down there close to the ground, eating grass. And we said a while ago, 4 inches, 90% of those L3 are going to be 4 inches or less, but a lot of our pastures, that's where the grass is going to be. So again, assess your risk at this point about what's fixing to happen if we get these rains that they're talking about in Oklahoma. And there may be, not everybody's from Oklahoma, but that's things you need to consider at this point. So what should you do next?
Barry,
Yeah,
please. One more L5 question this time. Do L5 worms ever become arrested?
no, L4 is the only stage that's arrested. Once you go to L5, they're going to mature to an adult.
Okay. Just want to make sure you got to that one before we
Okay,
move to the next
yeah.
segment.
So let's think about what we might want to do next. Um, talk about management. Again, can't rely on drugs to take care of this problem. What we're going to try to do is do some type of integrated parasite management. That means we're going to try to use every tool we've got available, and we're trying to prevent clinical disease and reduce production issues. We're not going to get rid of the parasites. So these are all things that we should be thinking about doing. I'm going to go over some of these. Some of these we're going to skip through because I don't think they necessarily they apply, but they may not be so important to us right now as we come out of a drought. I was happy to see that a lot of you are monitoring. That's going to be very important right now. Monitor your parasite loads. Famachu is very popular. It's easy in the sense it's relatively easy for us to do. We can do it on an individual basis. Don't have to have a lot of sophisticated equipment or take time to do anything. You can use that card and check them real quick. And I think it's a great way to check the goats. You have to remember it's only good for homuncus, though. It's not good for any of the other worms. That's why some people have kind of, I would say, suggested that we start doing 5-point checks, which looks at body condition score as well as a DAG score, which is the looking at the feces, how loose it is. You also want to make sure you look at coat, rough hair coats, or how the coats look, and you would pay attention for any submandibular edema or any, the nose on there is for nasal blots, but it's another good way to check and maybe give you a heads up if homuncus isn't your big problem. It's one of the other worms. Fecal egg counts are great. It would be probably not feasible to do a fecal egg count on every animal you have, but you may want to take some counts and just monitor, is the worm, get an idea, or my worm, my egg counts going up, would give you an indication that we might need to look at doing some treatments and those types of things. So whatever you do, you need to figure out how you're going to monitor your animals. So it's really important. I'm not going to talk about biosecurity, just that it is a good disease prevention method. It's important, especially if you purchase any animals, because you don't want to buy animals that have a lot of parasite issues and bring it into your herd or flock. Not going to talk much about the heritability. We know there's been reports that we can select for resistance and resilience. So just keep that in mind. May not be the time we're doing it right now as we come out of the drought, though. This is important nutrition. The longer I've been in veterinary medicine, the more I feel that nutrition is what we all ought to focus on, because you feed an animal right and the chances are they are not going to get sick. We know that protein supplementation, you'll get lower fecal egg counts. Now, you may have to feed above the requirements, and that may not be cost effective. I can't answer that for you, but we do know that increasing protein in the diet does help as far as parasite burdens are concerned. We also know that certain minerals and vitamins play a very important role in keeping parasites in check. Part of that's probably from immunity. The other part may be, like for iron, for instance, if you have homuncus and you have a lot of depletion of blood, you can deplete the iron sources too. So giving iron gives that which is very important for the production of red blood cells. May be the reason it has a positive impact. Copper oxide wire particles, we know that they are basically a dewormer, but they also improve immunity as well. So nutrition, focus on your nutrition. Make sure they're going to get all their needs met all the time. Pasture management. As we come out, again, I've said a lot of pastures that I see around here are pretty short. It's just because we've come out of that drought from last year and the grass hasn't started growing well. And we may have to sacrifice some spots, feed some hay if we've got it. I know that's in short supply too, and feed until the grass can get growing, and then maybe we can put them out on some other pastures for the rest of the summer, so to speak. There's a lot of research in grazing about small ruminants, and there's been intensive rotation grazing has shown that they'll show lower fecal egg counts, and a lot of times they'll show better weight gains. Interspecies grazing works well because parasites that bother sheep and goats don't normally bother cattle, with the exception of homuncus. We do have to be a little bit careful about homuncus because calves can get homuncus and it can be a production issue. They probably won't get sick and die the way small ruminants will, but they can get some weight gain issues and those types of things. So we have to be a little bit careful there. Not going to be a problem in adult cattle, but it could be a problem in young cattle. And remember, these pastures need rest. Cool season, probably 6 months is what you'd like to rest that pasture as possible. 3 months in the summer, at least closer to 6 weeks at a minimum before you come back to that pasture, because those L3 larvae will stay out there for a while. This happens to be a slide that I was given from Australia. And immunity here is low, but you can see it gets out to almost 90 days, and that's at a pretty high temperature before you start to see those L3 larvae going down. So that's why we say try to rest that pasture as long as you can before you put your animals back on it.
Okay, Barry, this is kind of along the same lines. And this says we rotate a ranch in 4 pasture rotation, 14 days on, 42 days rest. We do rest kidding pastures for 90 plus days over the winter. They seem to work well, but can you explain the situation? It may come where we need to speed up or slow down with only 4 pastures available.
I am definitely not Brian Frecking, the guru on electric fencing and pasture rotation and all that. I know people speed up because you've got a large available forage. So you have to keep moving to try to keep it from getting too tall and rank on you. So that might be a reason you have to speed up. In that situation, you're probably keeping your heads up pretty good. They're probably not getting down to that 4 inches. So that may be why but just trying to keep up with the grass, sometimes you have to speed up. A lot of people will slow down. I know when when the grass, and I forgot Laura was on there. She probably could answer the question better than me too, but sometimes people will slow down as it's kind of stops growing as fast so they can spend more time at a spot and then move on to the next because they're not trying to stay ahead of the grass. And you've got to factor that in. Everything has to be factored in because you can't just focus on parasite management, when we're looking at this. But I'm looking at strictly from a parasite standpoint in that I want to rest as long as I can because parasites, the longer we stay off of it, the less effective larvae there's going to be back there. And if we can get somewhere past, like I said, 6 weeks or so, that's great. If we could stay longer, it would be better. But as again, I focus on the parasite part of it. And you got to always remember your economic part of it. You got and what you have to do. So um, other things, I hope that helps. Not for sure I'm the best one to answer that from a grass management standpoint. Um,
Barry, I would think that our agronomists or rotate would say it's kind of more to do with the height of the grass, which
mhm,
gauge the
right.
time because you don't want to graze it short. And
No.
if you're 30 days in and you're shorter than normal, you probably want to speed it up and move them out
Hmm.
quicker. And if it's taller, you could stay in there a little longer if you wanted to,
Right.
but you don't want the other grass to get rank on you as well. So
Right.
I think the one thing I picked up on listening to those guys talk is that don't get stuck so much on number of days as you are how tall the grass is that you're grazing. So again, Laura's on here. She probably could tell us better than anything. So
Yeah. But other things that have been,
Sorry, I'm
go
driving
ahead,
in the
Laura.
rain. Sorry, I'm driving in the rain, so it might. I think
that's okay.
I would agree that it's more about the grass height. And it also depends. I don't know what forage. I didn't see in the comment that they said what forage they were talking about. If it's growing, if it's a cool season forage or a warm season forage, that's going to depend a lot on how quickly you need to rotate at different times of the year.
Okay.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Laura. Don't crash. We have too many meetings scheduled for you to talk in the next couple of months. So.
Also, there's other ideas about pasture management, cutting it for hay. Usually when we do that, you're going to eliminate those L3 larvae. They're going to get caught up in the bale. Bale should get hot enough that it kills them. Although there has been one report swearing that they fed to lambs that were clean hay and they got heavy infections with homunculus. Again, keeping their heads up, making sure they're grazing high and off that ground, and you may have to plant something. This picture here shows some type of sorghum or Sudan hybrid type grass that they're eating, and that keeps their heads up, less likely to pick up those larvae. Tilling the ground, if you can anytime we till that ground, we're going to do a lot of damage to the parasites because they can't handle that getting turned underneath into the soil. And also planting alternative forages like Sericea, Lespedeza that has some, and I think I have, that has some of those properties that are anti-parasitic. And we're not, some of the reasons those work, it increases protein, and it also has some negative impacts on the worm itself. They do damage the cuticle or the skin of that worm and those types of things. The only problem you have, like with Sericea lespedeza or some of those high tannin forages, you can't feed them all the time because they will have an impact on weight gain and that type of thing. So kind of pick your time. If you have those products available to you, use them at the times when you think you're going to have the most problems with worms. That's just a nice picture of a group of sheep grazing Sericea. Real quick about anthelmintics, got to always talk about dewormers. We've got 4 chemicals that we have available to classes, that is 4 chemicals. Now, some people combine the 2 in the middle here, but we have our benzimidazoles, your imidazolothiazoles, tetrahydropyrimidines, and macrocyclic lactones. Again, sometimes they combine the 2 in the middle as one because they work basically the same way, but they are different chemically. Just keep in mind, if you get resistance to a product Like if you have resistance to Safeguard, you are going to have some resistance to valbazen. It just may not be as bad. That's why sometimes you see variation in the effectiveness of these classes of drugs in these classes. But we do have resistance in all of these products. So none of them are great. Those that are approved for goats, you think about Safeguard, Positive Pellet, valbazen. Valbazen technically is only approved for flukes. Those for sheep, you got valbazen, Ivomec, and Sidectant, Drench, and then you have Prohibit. I don't want to spend very much time on this, but just keep in mind that by law, we are only supposed to use a product by what the label tells us how to use it, whether that's species, amount, how often, all those things. If we choose to use it in what we refer to as an extra drug label use, that veterinarians technically are the only ones that are able to do that. And they really are supposed to fulfill a certain set of requirements before they do that. And above all, they're supposed to set a withdrawal time on that product, because it's not going to be what's on the label anymore when you start changing dosages and how often you use it. So do what you want to do, but in my opinion, I would do everything I could to get my veterinarian to tell me how to use that product in an off-label manner. So in case something goes wrong, they will probably be more responsible for it than you will. Using these products, if we can sure improve how well they work. If above all else, do not underdose. If you underdose these products, they're not going to work. So either weigh your animals or know what the heaviest one is and dose accordingly. These are all oral products. That's the best way to use them because they get the product in contact with the parasite. Use a dose syringe. We want to get that product as far in the back of the mouth as possible because some of these animals will have what we refer to as the esophageal groove that develops when they're young and they're nursing, when the rumen isn't developed, and it lets that milk flow from into the omasum and into the abomasum. It bypasses the rumen, and some of them will continue to have that. So if you squirt something in their mouth and they swallow it liquid, well, it might bypass the rumen, and we want this product to stay in the body as long as possible. So if it gets to the rumen, it'll take it more time to get through the digestive tract. Other things you can do: hold off animals for 12 to 24 hours is shown to improve efficacy. And the reason it does is it slows down the amount of time that the material passes through the digestive tract. So we increase contact time with the drug. Deworm twice in 12 hours. That means like deworm at 8 in the morning and do it again at 8 in the evening. Works very well. We have actually used this at the meat forage buck test that we do at Wilburton, and we'll add a copper oxide wire particle to this, and it has worked very well on those goats that we have to deworm. And these goats will have a fecal egg count of above 2,000 before we'll deworm them in that test. So, and we found that it really we reduce those egg counts the next time we check them. So combining 2 or 3 classes of anthelmintics is probably one of the best ways to get the best efficacy out of your dewormers. And the reason that is if you use 2 wormers, we know that it's an additive effect, so that if you have maybe a dewormer that's 80% effective, it kills 80% of the worms, then you use another one that's 80% and it kills 80% of what's left. So now you got added 2 worms, you got 96% kill, which anything above a 90 would be good. So that's why it works so well. And again, the copper oxide wire particles are great to add to, especially, I think Dr. Burke's work, she used albendazole or valbazen, if I remember right, but it was a benzimidazole, and it improves their efficacy. So use these tools in your
Barry, got a
So,
question.
yeah,
Okay, so what about death? Death due to overdose, and basically, I think they're asking about prohibit. Thoughts on that?
as far as prohibit obviously is the only one that you got to be pretty close to the weight. When you use it, the rest of them have a lot wider safety margin, but prohibit has to be used. You need to deworm pretty close to the weight of the animal. You can't be off that much, but again, I've used the product, never had any trouble. I think I was pretty close to dosing it correctly. And so that's one you do have to be careful with, if that's what they're asking about there.
And the other
Yeah,
question we had, you talked a little bit about it, about combining 3 classes at once. But thoughts on the research behind this, and so you kind of mentioned that we're using that at the buck test.
yep.
So
If
so obviously we think it works pretty well.
yeah, it works there. And I list one reference there, but there's other references of using 2 or 3 dewormers and comparing it to just one and seeing a much better kill, or getting much lower fecal egg counts following that. So it's been researched, and it does work. Targeted selective treatment, all we're saying there is try not to deworm every animal in your flock or herd at once. If you can avoid it, base it on some type of like use Fomance or 5-point checks and deworm those animals that have to be dewormed. By doing so, we know that you're going to see improvements in health, and we're going to reduce anthelmintic use. So hopefully we're going to keep them around longer. And we can do this because we know that 20-30% of your goats or sheep have got 80% of your problems. So if you can take care of that, that's as good as deworming the whole flock or herd. Refugia, keep that in mind. That's the purpose of that, is trying to protect our dewormers and keep them keep them around as long as we can, because we don't have any new ones on the market and none in the foreseeable future. But refugia is just that population that's not getting exposed to your dewormer, and it's sensitive to that dewormer. So we hope that those worms will breed and dilute out resistant genes. I tell people all the time that if you're a sheep or goat producer, you got to be a worm producer as well, and you got to produce worms that are susceptible to the products that we have. That's what we're trying to do with refugia. Alternatives, things that you might look into, and I don't know if anybody's used biowormer. It does work. I would just say you got to look at the economics of it. I don't know how much it'll be worth. I won't say too much about the juniper and pine bark, but they have been added to diets, 30% of the diet, and we have seen reductions in fecal egg counts. So they do have some anti-parasitic properties to them. All these things are future. Your guess is as good as mine if we'll ever get any of these. Canada got StarTech a few years ago, and a lot of times when Canada gets something, we end up getting it, but that hasn't happened yet. So that's why it's so important to protect the dewormers we have, because they're not going to be, that's all we have. And if we get too much resistance in them, they're not even going to be useful to us. So lots of information out there for you. Any of these websites are great. The only thing I would say about the bottom two, they are one's from Australia and the other one's from England. You have to be careful. Some of the things they can do, we don't have access to those products, so just keep that in mind. I just say, does anybody have any questions? No, that was,
The only question we got so far, and I think I answered it right for this person, but they want to know if can they mix the wormers together in one solution, and instead of having to do 3 different guns.
and the answer to that question is no, because
That's what I
once you
thought.
mix it together, first of all, this is a problem in the United States. Other countries have combination dewormers. They're already mixed together. And the pharmacists that deal with that, they know how to mix the right ingredients and different things that allow those to bind together and they flow easily. So the products we have available, if you mix them together, they don't mix very well together. The second issue you have with that is, and again, nobody's going to be watching you, but technically the FDA says when you combine those two products together, you just made a brand new drug, and you better have the research that tells us that that new drug works and everything that goes along, all the safety protocol and everything else. Now, if I keep those two drugs in 2 separate dose syringes and give them together that way, that's not a new drug. We're using 2 separate drugs and so we don't have any problems. But once you combine them, that becomes a new drug, and we are not in the business. I'm not in the business of making drugs. Too much hassle with that, and you could technically get in trouble with it. That's why we don't combine. The biggest deal is they don't mix well, so I don't recommend putting them together.
Okay. Another question here, and you probably guessed what I'm fixing to ask here. Any experience with diatomaceous earth?
If you want to look at Dr. Burke, and she did some work, she wrote an article on that, but to date, I've never seen an article that shows a difference in using that and nothing and nothing. They don't see any change. With the exception, I did read one article that came out of India that showed some difference in rate of gain in some sheep that were on diatomaceous earth. And they hypothesize, they don't know, but they think there's a lot of minerals and stuff in that, and they're wondering if they were getting the benefits from a nutritional standpoint in using that. But I've never seen anything that proves it works when you take it and do a scientific study and use controls compared to the treatment group. A lot of people use it, swear by it, says it's great, but I just haven't been able to find any scientific evidence that proves it.
Are you reading that, Barry? You might want to read it out loud.
Okay. Can you talk about deworm? Whoops, I just lost it. Let me put it up here, JJ. Can you talk about dewormers used in combination with each other? Names of recommended dewormers. Okay. I should put, there's 4 classes of dewormers. When we use combination, we're going to use, if we use 2 or 3, we're going to use 1 dewormer from each class. So in the benzimidazoles, I'm going to use like Safeguard in goats. I'm going to use Valbazen in sheep because that's how they're approved. So that would be 1. And then I'm going to use a macrocyclic lactone, which I can use either one of those, Ivomec or Sidectin, in sheep. Now it's going to be an extra label drug use in goats, but you'd want to use 1 of those. You don't want to use 2 of them. Use 1 of those. So if I used Valbazen and Sidectin together, that would be 2 different classes of dewormers used at the same time. If I want to add a third, I have to use, one of the either Rumantel or Prohibit. Now, you do not, those are 2 different classes in my mind, but that's the same mode of action. You do not want to use both of those at the same time because that gets you into toxicity. That'd be like using double doses of one of those at the same time. You don't want to do that with them. So if you're going to use 3, mine would probably be, and it's just an opinion, would be Valbazen, Sidectin, and prohibit. That would be the three that I would pick. Or I might pick, safeguard and sidectin and prohibit. That type of deal. That's what you're trying to do when you use 2 or 3 in combination. I would get with my veterinarian though and talk with them about which they might have, especially in your area, because one of those drugs may work better than another, and you want to use the best one that you know out of each class that works in your area.
Okay. Any more questions? Okay. Okay, here you see that up there.
Okay, it was mentioned to treat 2 times 12 hours apart. If done in this manner, do you dose at half dose each time? No, use the full dose. You're going to use the full dose, and this has been researched with the benzimidazoles is the ones that's been used, like Valbazin or Safeguard, one of those products, and they use a full dose, and then 12 hours later use another full dose. And that's the products that you probably want to use. You wouldn't use prohibit. I should have put that in there. It's the benzimidazoles that this has been used on, the white wormers. So wouldn't use any of the other ones. And I'm sorry I didn't mention that. But yeah, 12 hours apart. And that's what we do at the bug test. We use Valbazin, albendazole. Give a dose in the morning and a dose in the evening. And it works well. Now again, we add a copper oxide wire particle to it as well. And it worked really well for us.
All right. Any more questions? If you think of some, I believe Barry's going to hang around to the end with me. You better, because he's got to watch the chat box for me while I do my talk.
Yep. Okay.
Okay. So one more question, then we'll get to mine here. I'll let you get that one.
Was told from a large producer that Epinex Poron had studies showing it helped with Barber Po. Is this true since it doesn't go through the stomach? Poron, if you saw that slide that I put up there, it showed, this has been researched again, oral is better than injectable, is better than Poron. Okay. So we know that given a product orally, it is going to do a better job at deworming than using a product injectable or pouring it on. Okay. So I am not aware of any studies that show Epinex helps with Barber Po. That doesn't mean that it's not out there, because there's a bunch of studies that are put out about dewormers. And you also have to remember, it's possible that they may be using Epinex in an oral solution in another country that I'm not aware of, but we don't have an Epinex solution that's made for oral administration. Okay. So I don't recommend using, I can't recommend using Porons orally, especially since we now have oral solution macrocyclic lactones orally. You've got Ivomix sheep drench, you've got Sidectin drench, sheep drench. So, and again, porons are not absorbed through the skin very well, and sheep and goat skin especially is not made to absorb those products. You'd be surprised in cattle that there's some studies indicating, even porons in cattle, that a lot of the good we get out of the porons is the cows licking off the poron on other cows. And it's really an oral, they're getting dosed orally. So I just wouldn't recommend using a poron in small ruminants at all.
Okay. I said one more question to do. I got somebody texted me on my cell phone. So ask a little bit more information about copper boluses is what it says, but I'm assuming it's kind of the copper wire particle boluses. I mean, I guess just talk about, how you give them and, kind of what they're used for.
Yeah, they're copper oxide wire particles. They're little copper if you get it, you look at them, they're little wire particles is what they are. And that's what we use. We don't use like copper sulfate or something like that. It's the particles that are used. And the dose, and you can find these if you want to look them up, but they usually recommend a 0.5 gram to 1 gram in lamb and kids. You kind of have to look at your weights and base it on that. If they're pretty small, you probably use a half. Get a little bigger kid or lamb, you give 1, and then 1 to 2 grams in adults, goats and sheep. It's given orally. There are different ways. You can buy them already in the capsule, or you can buy the particles and put them in capsules yourself, weigh them out. Dr. Burke from over in Arkansas at the Dell Bumpers Research Station has written a lot about that, and kind of explains how to do it. I would suggest going and Googling her and copper oxide wire particles and see if you can't find that information. We usually give them no more than is twice a year at the most. You do have to be a little bit concerned about copper toxicity in sheep and goats. Goats not as much as sheep, so that's why we have to be careful how often we use them. I have not seen any toxicity using them, which was a big concern when I started hearing everybody use them, but I have not heard anybody really have a big problem with that. But that's how we use them, and you'll usually put them in a capsule and just use some type of balling gun to put them down, and they'll go. Usually those wires go hang out in the abomasum, and that's where they do their damage. So